For months, Donald Trump and several of his top economic advisors made bold promises about the future of the American economy. Some projected GDP growth above 4%. Others went even further, suggesting growth could reach 5% or even 6%. Those predictions became a centerpiece of the economic argument surrounding Trump's policies, particularly tariffs, tax cuts, and the push to bring manufacturing back to the United States. But newly released economic data is raising serious questions about those forecasts. Instead of the explosive growth that was promised, the latest GDP numbers came in far below expectations. And critics are now asking whether the administration's economic projections were ever realistic in the first place. Let's break down what the new data shows, what Trump's advisors predicted, and why the gap between those promises and reality is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The latest economic report showed that first quarter GDP growth was revised downward to just 1.6%. That's not only well below the widely discussed 4% to 6% growth projections, it's also below many economists' expectations heading into the report. For context, GDP or gross domestic product is one of the most important measurements of economic performance. It tracks the total value of goods and services produced throughout the economy. When political leaders promise rapid economic growth, GDP is often the metric they point to as evidence that their policies are working. That's what makes this latest report so significant. After months of confident projections, the economy isn't accelerating towards 6% growth. Instead, it's expanding at a much slower pace. The contrast becomes even more striking when looking back at some of the statements made by Trump's economic team. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick repeatedly argued that Trump's economic agenda would trigger an unprecedented manufacturing boom. According to Lutnick, tariffs would encourage companies to build factories in America, leading to massive construction activity and stronger economic growth. At one point, he publicly predicted GDP growth above 4%. In another appearance, he went further and stated that the United States would eventually reach 6% annual GDP growth under Trump's leadership. Meanwhile, National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett pointed to rising capital investment as evidence that the economy was on the verge of a major expansion. Hassett argued that increased business spending, combined with tax incentives and reshoring efforts, could push economic growth above 4%, 5%, or even 6% at the time. These forecasts were presented with a high degree of confidence. But today, they look increasingly disconnected from the actual economic data. Economists across the political spectrum have long viewed sustained 6% GDP growth as extremely difficult for a mature economy like the United States. Developing economies occasionally experience growth at that level. The United States generally does not. Over the past several decades, average annual GDP growth has typically ranged between 2% and 3%. Periods above 4% have usually been temporary and tied to unique circumstances such as post-recession recoveries. Maintaining 6% growth for an extended period would require extraordinary increases in productivity, labor force participation, investment, or some combination of all three. That's why many economists were skeptical from the beginning when administration officials started discussing those numbers. GDP wasn't the only disappointing figure in the latest economic reports. Personal income data also came in weaker than expected. Income growth was essentially flat during the month, while consumer spending continued to rise. That creates an important challenge for households. When incomes aren't increasing but spending is, consumers are forced to rely on savings, borrowing, or reduced financial flexibility. Inflation remains a major concern as well. Even if price increases have slowed compared to previous peaks, many Americans continue to feel pressure from the cost of groceries, housing, insurance, and everyday necessities. This helps explain why economic sentiment often differs from official economic statistics. People don't evaluate the economy by reading GDP reports. They evaluate it by looking at their bills. If families feel they're paying more while earning roughly the same amount, optimism becomes difficult regardless of what headline statistics say. The danger for any administration comes when expectations are set too high. Promising 6% growth creates a benchmark that is extremely difficult to reach when actual results fall far short. Critics gain an opportunity to argue that voters were oversold on what economic policies could realistically deliver. This doesn't necessarily mean the economy is collapsing. nor does it automatically mean every policy has failed. But it does mean there's now a growing gap between the forecasts that were promoted and the numbers being reported. And that gap is becoming a political story of its own. Supporters of Trump's economic agenda argue that many of the benefits from tariffs, domestic manufacturing investment, and business expansion will take time to appear. They believe future quarters could show stronger growth as projects move forward and investment spending continues. Critics, however, argue that the first quarter data reflects a broader pattern of overpromising and underdelivering. The next several GDP reports will likely determine which side has the stronger argument. If growth accelerates significantly, administration officials may claim the strategy is working exactly as intended. If growth remains sluggish, questions about those ambitious 4%, 5%, and 6% projections will only intensify. The latest economic data delivers a simple reality check. After months of predictions about historic growth, the economy is currently expanding at a much more modest pace. Whether that changes in the coming quarters remains to be seen. But for now, the numbers are nowhere near the levels that were repeatedly promised, and in politics, expectations can be just as important as results. What do you think? Were the 6% GDP forecasts realistic from the beginning? Or could the economy still surprise everyone in the months ahead? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest analysis.